So, good evening or hello. Thanks for joining live or indeed on YouTube. Um, this evening we're going to be talking to Eva about her latest book, Courage in Chaos. It's her second book with Barnthorne Publishing, the Lucknow Residency being the first one, and this very much picking up on that topic. And we're going to go through some of the detail of that over the course of the next 30-40 minutes. Um, Introduction first to Barnthorne Publishing. We've been going nearly 2 years now. Eva was one of our first authors that was with us at early doors back in the end of 2023. We're a independent publisher. We specialise mostly in military history. We've got some kind of other titles fringing around that. And yeah, we're consistently welcoming in new authors. Sometimes these are experienced authors, but often these are first-time authors. So we're up for either route. We're happy to support and try and make the process as accessible as we can. So Eva, that's the push for Barnthorne. Over to yourself, but please introduce yourself.
Well, good evening, everyone. I think most of you already know me. I'm Eva Chatterji. I am the writer of the Lucknow Residency, now Courage in Chaos. I started writing about the mutiny, already back when I was around 16. I started my first researches when I was living in India. I was born in Canada, but I grew up in Bangladesh and in India, and I had some background in Sri Lanka as well. So I didn't really actually start doing any serious writing until I got extremely annoyed when I went to the Lucknow residency and saw what a mess it was and decided I needed to do something about it. So that's where the entire journey started, and it hasn't ended yet, just carrying on.
Indeed, and I think I remember rightly. It was back in your education that you came across a book or a few different kind of books, and that kind of started sparking your interest.
Oh, yes, one of them was called The Great Mutiny by a gentleman named Fitchett. And he fudged it. It's actually a dreadful book. Now that I read it back, it's ghastly. But it was a way to get into the whole thing. And then I picked up other books along the way. And actually, the Fitchett book is with me still. The school library, I'm sure they don't miss it. So so that was I kept it because exactly for that reason, to remind myself what I don't want to do. I don't want to be Fitchett. So there we go.
Yeah, no, you're. It sounds like you're far from that. So, uh, let's talk about your first book first. So, the Lucknow Residency. So, for those that have yet to purchase it, and why not? It's a guide around the Lucknow Residency. Obviously, feeding in the history as you're walking round. So, if you ever get the chance to go to Lucknow, it's the perfect companion. But do you want to just give us a bit more about that in terms of set the scene in terms of that book? What covered, what it didn't cover as such, and then we'll move on to Courage in Chaos.
Okay. Well, the first book basically just covers the residency. It doesn't get very much into detail about the history of the mutiny. There is some background, but not a lot, because the idea generally was to put out a guidebook for anybody who wanted to go to the residency, walk around, have a basically better idea of what the place is all about. Because honestly, when one goes there, you see a few ruined buildings, some poorly written signs, and that's it. And that generally leaves people either mystified, horrified, or bored. So my idea was to give people something more to do when they're there, because the site essentially takes hours to get through, and it can't take hours to get through if you don't know what you're looking at. So that's basically what I went for. And I also went for the background of the siege, because the siege does feature in history, but it's not something that's generally taught. So people generally have an idea, yes, there was a siege of Lucknow, but what was it? And above all, who was there and what were they doing and how did they survive? How did they live? So the book actually goes more into the details of the people who were there, and gives an overview of what they were up to. How did they actually manage to get through fairly horrifying months? I mean, they were stuck in there from the beginning of July till the almost middle of November.
Mm.
So how did they manage to get through this? And so the book is focusing on the interior of the Lucknow residency. and looks into the aspects of how one could survive a siege in 1857.
And I mean, I think what I loved about it was obviously having walked the ground yourself, you had those modern photos from your own visits. But then you had this combination of, artwork or sketches,
Mm,
sometimes maps and detailed plans. And that really kind of brought it to life because, the site is so much changed now, obviously
mm,
with 1857 being increasingly further away. And I think without the kind of content you've added, I don't think it would be possible to get the full story as such.
mm,
And I think the individual stories, I recall reading of, obviously some of the men who feature quite prominent in terms of the actions, but also the women, the wives or family members or staff of these people,
mm,
and how they had nowhere to go either. So themselves, the boys in the school, they were all in it together. And they all kind of, come out with their different stories. So yeah, I think that's brilliant. So I guess with this book then, so how does that pick up from there? What are we looking at this time?
Well, this time, what we're looking at with Courage and Chaos is the outside. What happened outside of the residency? The whole problem with the residency really was someone had to come and get them out. And the question was, how are we going to do it? Lucknow was fairly far away from most centers. It's not geographically, it's not that easy to get to. Even now, it's not that easy to get to. And they had to bring in people to bring the besieged out. And the whole question now was, how are they going to do it? And this was going to be done in different phases. There was no way to do it all at once. It had to be done in different phases. So this book picks up from the second one. The first one, we're looking at what's happening inside. How
Hmm.
are they getting along from day to day? And this one is looking at what they're doing on the outside to get them out.
Yeah.
It looks less into the residency itself. There are sections of it that do deal with the residency, but this is more how was the residency itself communicating, for example, with Havelock's force or with Campbell? How were they passing messages along? What were they speaking about? What were the workings, the actual mechanics of breaking the siege, which is what the book gets into. It also gets quite a lot into more of the details of the battles that were fought in order to relieve the residency. I mean, this was not just we're going to walk in and take them out. This took a lot of work and a lot of organization. So that's where the book is coming from. It's a bit more on I wouldn't say on the technical side, but it certainly goes more into war, far more than the first book did.
Yeah, and I guess to set the scene, what kind of period of time are we talking about from, the siege starting through to the relief as such?
Well, the siege actually started in July after the Battle of Chinhut. Chinhut was the 30th of June. So they were besieged after that because they were thrashed at Chinhut. They messed that one up. So they ended up being besieged from around the 1st of July. The first signs of mutiny in Lucknow were already in May. But Sir Henry Lawrence had managed to keep everything pretty much in order until they went out and fought them at Chinhut. So that was a bit of a mess. But the book actually starts in June, setting up in Benares, which is now Varanasi, and Allahabad, which today is called Prayagraj, I believe. It's a very complicated name. Anyway, we're going to stick to the old names because they're easier to pronounce. So so it's Benares and Allahabad. We're going to start there. That's where the book starts. Because the first force that came up to start the suppression of the mutiny came from Madras. That would have been the first Madras European Fusiliers under Colonel Neil, James Neil, who would have a rather dreadful reputation by the time all of this was over. But he was instrumental in setting up Benares and Allahabad as centers of communication with Calcutta and opening communication with Kanpur and other places in India. So he was very vital in getting that started. So actually, it does start, the relief operation started essentially in June. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
well before, because the idea wasn't initially Lucknow, it was Kanpur. Neil was supposed to be leading a force, or whoever was supposed to be leading a force to the relief of General Wheeler in Kanpur. But things didn't quite pan out that way. And Kanpur capitulated a lot faster than anybody thought they would. They were dead in the water already in June.
Hmm.
So they had to then change their plans. And then Lucknow came about in July. So the focus switched to, well, what can we do for Lucknow? Yeah.
Definitely. So in the as such an outline of the book, so it starts, as you say, in June. Do you want to just give us kind of like a high level kind of précis of how how the book tackles the subject, like what sections you've got, etc.
Right. Well, we start off in Allahabad and Benares because there were two mutinies there, and Neil was instrumental in putting down both of them. If he hadn't been able to do that, then there probably would not have been a relief of anybody because they would have lost the station. So he needed to set that up to get those two stations secure. Then we move into, actually, I do give some details about the siege in Kanpur because this, of course, has repercussions throughout all of India, and it was also the main motivation to actually move into that area of India in the first place was to relieve Kanpur, and that was then taken up by Sir Henry Havelock. He started the first relief operations for Lucknow, but initially to go and help Kanpur. Unfortunately, he was late, and nothing happened of any meaning to the people there because they were all dead by the time he arrived.
Mm.
Um, and then, of course, the book then moves into the first relief of Lucknow, which was in September. And then we move into the blockade of Lucknow, which is what happened when Havelock finally got there. And then we come into the second relief of Lucknow under Sir Colin Campbell. And then finally, how the siege was broken. So that's basically the outline of the book.
Yes. So I guess to pick up to start with then, so you mentioned Havelock. So tell us a bit more about him, what's his background, how does he, come into the story, and so on.
Well, Sir Henry Havelock was a very interesting gentleman. He was actually the son of a shipbuilder, a rather wealthy shipbuilder. He was born in 1795. He was the second of four sons. And initially, it was intended that he should become a lawyer, join the bar. He wasn't meant to go to the army. His brothers did. He wasn't supposed to. His mother had other aspirations for him, but it didn't quite work out because his father lost his wealth, and Henry had to give up studies. His brother actually managed to get him a position in the, I believe, I'm not quite sure, just a second, I believe he joined the army when he was around 17 or 18. But he didn't leave England for another 8 to 10 years. He was on home duty. His regiment wasn't going anywhere. They were basically sitting at home. He was with the 95th Regiment of Foot. And in 1822, when he realized, hey, this isn't doing me any good, he transferred to the 13th Regiment, which was under Robert Sale. Sale, we know from Afghanistan. And he set off for India. And along the way to India, he met up with a young lieutenant named Grant, James Grant, who introduced Havelock to religion. He had grown up in a religious household, but they weren't tough on it. So basically, he picked up religion on the way to India. And when he arrived in India, he was basically a reformed man. And I think this is what makes Havelock such a very intriguing character because we're looking at a gentleman who believed he believed in God, but he also believed God would show him the way. He was very, very clear about giving up the material side of life. He left everything, his soul, to God. So when he was always ready to die. He was never afraid to die. And this makes him such an intriguing person. He never had that sense of mortality because he somehow always felt his soul was immortal. Yeah. But he was very humble. He was not in your face. He didn't convert Indians to religion. He converted other Englishmen. So when he went to Burma, First Burmese War, he was there. He managed to get his gentlemen to stop drinking and behave themselves, and they were basically the only ones who didn't fall over when they were on parade. So they were dubbed Havelock Saints. Yeah, and he actually ended up building some of the first, making some of the first coffee bars in the Indian Army. You know, and reading rooms, to get people away from drinking. He set up Bible classes, open air church services. Um, he was very interested in the British soul.
Mm.
Um, the Indian soul, he figured, was pretty much taken care of. They had their own thing going, but he was very interested in the British soul, and you see that in the way he treats his men. He treated his men with with a lot of respect. He never left anyone behind on a battlefield. He always took them with him. Um, he never, he always had the time to consider, what is best for them. He never expected anyone to do anything that he wouldn't do. If he wouldn't do it, then he didn't expect anyone else to do it. The thing is, Havelock was ready to do just about anything. So, so at the end of the day, we have someone who's tremendous convictions of himself, um, and he expected a heck of a lot from the people who served under him. And what I think was also quite intriguing with him was, he spent a lot of time in his life being a captain. He was 23 years, he was a captain. He had no money for a promotion. He was married quite early. He had a lot of children. He had children to educate in England. He had no money to buy himself commissions. So he basically stayed where he was for a very long time. And I think that's why Lucknow finally was his, the taking the force to Lucknow was his first big command. So it would also be his only big command. Um, so we have a man who's very ambitious, but he never puts himself forward. He would never ask anyone, look at me, I'm here. I want to do something. He let that all up, let that all up to God. God will look after me, and God will look after my path. So he's a very interesting character. He carried the entire burden of the force on his own shoulders. Yeah.
So I guess from the timeline you've given, he obviously had quite a long military career. I think you said obviously he went to India in the early 1820s. So by
Mhm.
the time we're at 1857, he's served a long time, albeit quite a lot of it as captain.
Yeah.
So quite experienced in some senses, but perhaps not in terms of the command
Exactly. I mean,
aspect of
not
it.
exactly. His position finally in 1852, he was Quartermaster General to the army. He became a colonel finally. And in 1854, he actually was settling down as Adjutant General for India. But then 2 years later, Sir James Outram shows up and whips him off to Persia. So, but no, he was a very long time in India, and he was also a very long time in places like Bombay. He did serve in the Gwalior campaign. He was in the Sikh Wars. He was in Afghanistan. He had a lot of military experience. He wasn't a desk job man. He
Mm.
just never had the opportunity to shine. Yeah, have a look. Because he would never put himself forward, he never rose to the great name, yeah, during his career.
And I guess so on this occasion, it wasn't a case of him finally putting himself forward, that he was selected for the
Mhm.
job.
Yes, he was selected by the commander in chief to lead the force to actually Kanpur and then Lucknow. That was the intention. They chose him for it. But of course, when he arrived from the Persia campaign in Calcutta, they were rather they weren't very polite to have a look. I mean, people were talking behind his back. He was a fossil, uh, only fit for pipe clay. Was one of the terms they used. Another one was, of course, Lady Canning invited him for dinner, and he showed up in full dress uniform, wearing all of his medals, campaign medals, and his sword clanking by his legs. And she basically said he looked like someone who was wearing an entire bank around his neck. They basically said he'll do. They didn't give him, he they didn't give him great praise. They just said he's a capable officer. He's the best we have, considering what was floating around India at the time. He really was pretty much the best they had. And he was steady, capable, and honest. So, what more could they want at the time? Yeah.
Indeed. So, amongst that, you mentioned Sir James Outram. So, I guess the same question for Sir James.
Well, Sir James is a slightly different character. He's also younger. He was born in 1803. Um, his father was actually a civil engineer, but his father died when he was very young. So his mother whipped the kids up to Scotland to be brought up. And his life was something of a, if one can use that term nowadays, a boy's own adventure. That's how he was portrayed. This was a man who was very ambitious. He was extremely ambitious. At school, he was not particularly good at school, but he was already up there fighting the bullies. Outram was a pale, small child, according to description. So he wasn't exactly what one would imagine, this great big character like John Nicholson who strides into a room and everyone looks at him. No, he had to box his way to the top, and he boxed for other boys too. And when he was punished, he took it well. And he was always looking out for the little guys. So he made his name already in school as the man for the underdog. And actually, his mother, uh, who was a forceful character herself, she decided he was supposed to become a clergyman. But he basically, in a chat with his sister, he said, "Look, there's a window. If she makes me become a clergyman, I'll jump out the window and join the army as a regular soldier." So his mother was a little bit scared that, this isn't going to work. She didn't want her boy to join up as a common soldier. So after a lot of wangling here, there, and everywhere, they got him a cadetship actually in Addiscombe. But because his brother was there, Francis, who was the good boy in the family and an excellent student and very handsome and everything going well for him, James didn't want to be in his brother's shadow. So he chose not to go to Addiscombe. And in 1819, he was off to India with a direct cadetship into the East India Company Army. And he joined up in Bombay. And then he actually started moving up very, very quickly. He was acting adjutant for the 12th Regiment Bombay Army in 1820 already. 25, he was already training his first light infantry corps, and they were made up of billed tribesmen. So they gave him a fairly difficult job, taking men who basically live their lives in jungles with bows and arrows and turn them into an infantry corps. And then he was given the opportunity to get into political work. So he was a political assistant in Gujarat. He was joined up in the first Afghan war, but not as a common man. He went there as an ADC to Sir James Kane, and he took part in raids, captured a banner at Ghazni. He was out there doing everything, and finally he went back to Sindh, and he became a political agent in Sindh for the government, and gained his name as the Bayard of India because he defended the Hyderabad Residency against 8,000 rather upset Baluchis. So he had a heck of a reputation already riding on him. And he wasn't like Havelock, who stood in the background and waited for good things to happen. James Outram went out and got things for himself. Unfortunately, while this was going on, he was also annoying a lot of people because he'd never stopped being a protector of the weak, the poor, the disgruntled, and he was weeding out corruption in the East India Company wherever he saw it. So they were a little bit irritated with him because he was starting to make them look bad.
Hmm.
So what they did in 1856, they packed him off to Lucknow to be resident in the court of Wajid Ali Shah. And that went off actually rather well until they decided to annex the place. And then he became the first commissioner, chief commissioner of Lucknow, a purely political position. But of course, then Persian War came along, and they needed somebody with a reputation and a proven reputation for leadership. So they took him from Lucknow and sent him as commander of the expeditionary force to Persia. And then this is just where he went on from there. So he was very much a political agent. He was a military man, and he was somebody who he could sense people. I think Outram had a very good sense of people. He knew where it would be most advantageous for himself above more things. And he was also very big on putting out his own reputation. I mean, there's a book that came out, um, even in I think the book was from 1914 or 1915. He's still out there. The manliest of the men, the great tiger hunter, the flag capturer. He was well into this century, into the last century. They were still putting Outram out there as the man you want to be when you grow up. So that's where he comes into this. He was actually his position in the entire expedition was not essentially a military one. It was supposed to have been a political one. He was supposed to have taken over the division of Kanpur, the Kanpur division as a political agent. But unfortunately, because Havelock had to retreat back over the river, and he wasn't making any progress, um, the idea from Calcutta was to get Outram to replace Havelock in a nice way. But Outram, being the chivalrous gentleman that he is, refused. He refused to take the command away from Havelock. He let him have Lucknow. And then he took over as commissioner of Lucknow when they arrived in the Residency. And then he took over practically everything, back to what he used to be. Yeah, but the taking of Lucknow, he left to Havelock. Mm.
And that was that's the first relief in effect
Yes.
at this point.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm,
So just to recap, so very contrasting careers
mm,
and personalities to boot. So Havelock not quite impressing management
mm,
in the early throes. So Outram then is potentially the shoe-in,
mm.
but he lets Havelock have the moment and succeed in the first relief of
Yeah.
Lucknow.
Mm, mm,
Yeah. So
mm. Mm.
what I guess what happens next? I think is it Sir Colin Campbell? Does he enter the fray soon after?
Yes, he does. But first, of course, what had happened is that just a little bit of background for that. Havelock had done his best. He had a force of some 2,500, 3,000 men, which was, meant to take Kanpur. He was meant to relieve Kanpur. And I mean, the horror of it all was, the day they actually had the Battle of Kanpur was the same day the women were murdered in the Bibi Ghat, the last survivors of Fatehgarh and Kanpur. So this was a tremendous blow to him. And now he was going to do everything he could to relieve Lucknow. And he tried. He fought 9 battles, backwards and forwards. He took Bassi that gun. She took it 3 times. You know, he was desperate not to give up. But finally, he had to admit, look, this is not working. I'm losing men. They're dropping like flies from disease, from the sun, from wounds. Um, he was holding Kanpur. Neil was actually left in Kanpur to hold it while he went off across the river to try and gain Lucknow. And he finally realized this isn't going to work. So he had to sit down and wait. And that was August. So he was sitting in Kanpur from August, waiting for reinforcements because he realized, the 2,000 men left to me, there's nothing I can do. Either I lose Kanpur and move to Lucknow, and I'll never get there because they'll kill me along the way, or I wait. So he made the wise decision to wait. Unfortunately, the people in Calcutta didn't see it that way because Colonel Neil was writing behind Havelock's back. He had been superseded actually by Havelock by seniority because Neil was under the impression he would be leaving the force, and that didn't happen. So Neil was a very disgruntled and very disappointed gentleman. And he was writing to Calcutta behind Havelock's back and telling them, look, he's a disgrace. He's basically, yeah, we've lost face. We've lost face and we must regain it. So they were very desperate to regain face. And of course, they sent Outram to help them with that. And then, of course, what Havelock finally did when he had the reinforcements, when James Outram showed up, when everything was in place, they set off for Lucknow. And the first thing they took was the Alambagh, which would be a center of operations not only for Havelock, but for Colin Campbell in the next few months, actually throughout most of the Oud campaign into 1858 as well. and then they marched into Lucknow. But it was not, one imagines that taking the first relief of Lucknow as something extremely organized and well planned. It was well planned, but they had some issues with their intelligence wasn't very good. They didn't know who they were facing. They didn't know where the rebels had their positions. They didn't realize they'd been digging up the roads. They didn't know where they actually had their guns. They didn't really know. So when they finally got over the Charbagh Bridge, the force got dispersed into different directions. And finally, what happened with the first relief of Lucknow, it took 2 days to get the entire force into the Residency, which was not a good show. He lost 535 men dead, wounded, and missing. And the missing was very, very bad because most of them, some 40 of them were murdered in their doolies, in their carriers that they were in, the covered carriages that they were in, and some of them were even burned alive. So this did not reflect well on
Mm.
the entire. People were extremely angry. The men who fought with him were extremely angry, that the wounded had been left behind, that the force got dispersed throughout the entire city, that nobody knew where they were going. I mean, the Highlanders, 78th Highlanders, ran off in the wrong direction. Yeah. We've got people scattered all around Lucknow doing something somewhere. But the urgency was, of course, they were under the impression that the Lucknow Residency was starving to death, which wasn't true. But Inglis didn't know he actually had food, because, of course, they were very, very busy keeping themselves alive. Nobody was keeping the books. So nobody really knew what was going on. So Havelock did what he could under the impression he would be able to whip everybody out of the Residency and run back to Kanpur, and it didn't happen. They ended up blockaded in Lucknow without any way to get out. They didn't have enough men. He didn't know how many civilians there were in Lucknow, and he didn't bet on them having that many wounded with them. So they basically had to sit back and wait for Sir Colin Campbell to show up. Yeah.
And just to context, so obviously you mentioned a couple of numbers there. So prior to reinforcement, Havelock had about 2,000 men at Cawnpore. How many did he then have, or roughly, when he then got to Lucknow with that expanded force, if you like?
Well, he had to leave a certain amount of men behind in Kanpur because they had to hold Kanpur. And then he also had to leave a certain amount of men behind in the Alambagh, to keep that as their base. So he basically went into Lucknow with something like 3,700. Um, and yes, then over the next few months, some 200 of them died in the Residency or they were injured. So his force was gradually disappearing. And plus there were the 535 they lost outright. Yeah. So they didn't have enough people anymore to fight their way back out. I mean, Inglis had the 84th and he had the 32nd, but we have to imagine the men had been under siege for quite a few months now. They were not well.
Mhm.
They were not strong enough. Nobody was strong enough to physically fight their way back out anymore. And we have to imagine Havelock's estimate of wounded and civilians was over 1,200. I mean, how is he going to bring them out with the resources that he had? He couldn't. And the decision finally wasn't even with him, it was Outram. Outram had a plan. He had a plan. He wanted to run in there and grab everyone and run back out again. When he realized it wasn't possible, he had a very callous plan, actually, to leave the 90th behind with 4 guns to reinforce Inglis and leave with everyone else and fight his own way back to Kanpur. That was his idea. And then finally, when this idea came around, yeah, people were not particularly pleased that now this relief force is here and they're about to leave us here again to our
Mm.
fate. So he finally figured that Calcutta would not be impressed if he just buggered off after a few days. Then said, right, then here's a regiment and 4 guns and have fun. No, he couldn't do that. He had to save his own reputation, so he had to stay. So they stayed in Lucknow until November. The blockade actually started around the 27th of September, and Sir Colin Campbell showed up on the scene in Lucknow on the 16th of November in front of the Residency. Yeah.
And I assume on the other side of the fence, as such, they've have they got a greater number of of the force of the well, I don't know the correct way of saying it, but
Insurgents, mutineers,
yeah,
rebels. Yeah.
yeah. So they've obviously probably got a larger force that's
Yes,
more able to move around, more
mhm,
provisions accessible, or that they can nip down the road and get what they need. Whereas, they are blockaded
absolutely,
at
absolutely.
Lucknow. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, I mean, Havelock and Outram had managed to extend the residency position to include a few palaces, so the pressure on the residency itself was less because the rebels were now a little bit further away. They were not sitting right on the walls anymore. They were actually pushed back a few hundred feet, in some cases up to 1,000 feet back away from the walls. So that actually helped. But yes, I mean, the rebels, they had the insurgents, they had plenty of stores, they had plenty of ammunition, they had plenty of reinforcements because everywhere where there was a rebellion, um, Lucknow was the sort of the center point. If you can't go to Delhi, many of them went to Delhi, but the ones that didn't go to Delhi, they came to Lucknow. So no one is actually sure how many insurgents there were because we have to also have to remember that the local landlords, talukdars, zamindars, the whole lot, who were all very disappointed with the East India Company, they sent their men as well. So they had their own local levies
Mm.
kicking up a fuss. And the rebels at the highest estimates were between 10 and 15,000, if not more. Why they didn't take the residency is a story for itself, one can imagine. They certainly had the manpower to do it, but they didn't. Um, but yeah, they had a tremendous amount of people on the outside who were, yeah, they had nothing to lose. They were well set in, they were well dug in, they had everything they needed to besiege the residency ad infinitum as long as they wanted. Yeah.
So I guess obviously in a time where communications were perhaps a lot more manual, shall we
Yeah.
say? So how does how is the message going back from Lucknow? And then how do they then arrange what happens next with Colin Campbell and co?
Well, they had a very interesting setup. Outram had a setup of like a semaphore, which he was communicating with the Alambag, and codes were being sent over through messengers. Messengers were very highly paid, um, and they needed to be because most of them wound up dead. Very few actually made it all the way through to Kanpur. From Kanpur, there was a setup of postal messages called the Dak. They also had telegraph from Kanpur.
Mm.
So they could actually send messages from there already, as long as the insurgents along the road weren't, messing around with the lines or killing the postman, which also happened. But they were able to get messages all the way to Allahabad and to Benares by road. So there was a communication network it's set up. And then from Allahabad and Benares was actually easier to telegraph than to Calcutta or anywhere else. Um, but to actually get messages out of the residency required spies and messengers, and they had to be brave enough to leave with a message. The messages had to be very small. They're written on little scraps of paper, anything that they could put anywhere in their body. So they were putting the messages in their ears. In sticks was a very common one, sole of their shoe. So if they were caught, they they would hope that nobody would find the message. Um, but that's basically how they were communicating initially, was through very small scrolls of paper. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's
Mm.
so introduce us to Colin Campbell then. So yeah, what's his background? How does he come into the story?
Well, we have to first, of course, give him his real name. His real name was Colin McLiver, but he had a relative who decided that Campbell really did sound a little bit better. So he became Colin Campbell. He was 15 years old when he joined the army. He was born, I believe, 3 years before Havelock. So he was older. And Colin Campbell, he pretty much did all of it. He was everywhere. We have him in the Peninsular Wars. We have him in Waterloo. We have him in the First Opium War. We have him in the Second Sikh Wars. Um, he'd seen it all and done it all. He was in Canada. Did a little brief stint in Barbados. And of course, as everyone knows Colin Campbell, maybe not from Lucknow, but they certainly know him from the Crimea because that wonderful painting of the thin red line. Uh,
Mm.
that's Sir Colin Campbell. And after Crimea, he actually thought, well, this is done. I'm going home, which he did. He was Inspector General for the infantry and running messages for the Queen. Um, but then the mutiny happened, and they needed a man who had vast military experience, who also knew India, which he did. Maybe not as extensively as Outram and Havelock, but he had his experience. And someone who could take over the position of commander-in-chief in India. Because the commander-in-chief, Anson, was dead. He died before Delhi was even thought about. And the gentleman they had there at the time was Sir Patrick Grant. He was from Madras. He had been given the position by Canning due to seniority. He was the senior most officer in India, so they gave him the position of commander in chief. Unfortunately, Sir Patrick Grant decided that he liked his war as far away from him as possible, so he spent his entire mutiny career sitting in Calcutta, not doing much. So when Sir Colin Campbell arrived in August, he arrived with a plan. He'd basically made a plan of how he's going to end the mutiny um, the day he arrives. Basically, he'd spent the entire month on ship studying maps, getting information, and he'd set up a plan. And most of his plan actually worked out right up to 1858 and 59. So he was very long-term thinking. Um, but when he arrived in Calcutta, of course, he had to first deal with the government, who had spent many months tearing their hair but not doing a lot. When he arrived, they weren't even producing Enfield ammunition in India. They were running out of flour. They didn't have horses. The forgeries out in the ironsmiths, they were sitting around doing nothing. They had left pretty much the running of the arrival of all the troops and sending them on was being left to one gentleman named Orphew Kavanagh. He was the major in in running the city of Calcutta. He was doing everything pretty much by himself, but how much can one man do alone? And the government was sitting around twiddling their thumbs and hoping for the best. They were letting people get on with it. And there was a lot to get on with because everyone was having something to get on with. And what, of course, what they had was they still hadn't taken Delhi. The Punjab was restless, but there we have Sir John Lawrence, who was keeping everyone pretty much in order. Bombay had a small insurrection in Kolhapur, so they couldn't use Bombay troops. They weren't able to trust, many of the Nizams and the Nawabs. They weren't sure who stood where with what. So they were biding time, hoping something good would happen eventually. And Sir Colin Campbell showed up, and within 6 weeks, he had the entire war machinery up and running. He didn't take no for an answer. They were producing ammunition. He ordered flour from the Cape. He sent one of his very able officer down to Bihar to organize horses from the stud. They had studs all over India, but nobody was gathering up the horses, so he was doing that. Um, and then he also organized transportation of the troops. How are we going to get them from A to B? He created a very, very clever system. So at its peak, when it was actually running by October, he was able to send 200 men a day from Calcutta. First, they would take a train to a place called Raniganj. That was the junction of the train. And then from Raniganj, they would take bullock carts. And within 2 weeks, they were in Allahabad. So, but he was doing this every day, 200 men every day, as reinforcements were coming in. So he was really working on getting everything up and running. And he basically gave Calcutta no option. I will run the war for you, and you will listen. That was Colin Campbell's strategy, basically. He didn't show up in Kanpur until the 3rd of November. but he had the opportunity to send plenty of reinforcements along already. One of them, of course, was the Naval Brigade. They had arrived in India, so the Shannon Brigade was already on their way to Kanpur. And then, of course, Delhi was taken in September. And there they decided from Delhi that a column would be sent from Delhi to the relief of Lucknow. So he already had more men already on the ground and acclimatized and ready to go, who were marching from Delhi.
Yeah, so he certainly seemed like he came in, gripped the situation, the right man for
Yeah.
the job, and really at this point from where you've left it, well placed now for the relief, the second relief of
Mhm.
Lucknow to follow. So obviously we know that the residency ultimately is safe. So should we kind of wrap up the story to some extent of how this concludes,
Sure.
and then we'll go from there.
Well, I think what's interesting with the second relief of Lucknow is that Sir Colin Campbell wasn't taking any chances. He took his time. He planned it out very well. He started his operations, around the 14th. He wasn't rushing. He didn't follow the same route as Havelock. He took a long way around to get them in the back, basically, where nobody was expecting him to show up from. He'd set up positions along the way so that he could retreat. Colin Campbell was not a fool, definitely not a fool. He did not want to get stuck in Lucknow. And he realized even if he threw 10,000 men at the Residency, he still could not hold Lucknow. It was impossible. So he decided in a very, well, the only strategy he had open to him, grab everyone, pack them up, take them back to Kanpur, hold the Alambag. He actually left Outram in Alambag for the next few months with something like 4,000 men. He could stay there. And he took everyone back to out of the Residency into Kanpur. And he actually did it in a very clever way that the insurgents didn't even realize the Residency was empty until they were all gone. Yeah. So, and of course, the story is tragic in that sense because it ultimately the man who started the whole thing never saw the end of it because Havelock died. Yeah, he died before leaving Lucknow. Yeah.
And was that of natural causes, or how did that come about?
It was a combination of a few things. It was stress, um, disease. Ultimately, he was killed off by dysentery, but exhaustion played a very large role in that.
Mm.
And there was nothing they could do for him. He wasted away. Yeah.
As you say, it's just a great shame that he, having been in the story for that long,
Mm.
that's how it ended. So, I guess I know, obviously, not expecting you to cover the history of British India from this point onwards, but I guess in summary, what kind of happens next? In India, what's the aftermath of this?
Well, the aftermath of this was quite interesting because Sir Colin Campbell decided to abandon Lucknow. He said, "Fine, you can have it. I'll be back. Just you wait, I'll come back, but you can have it for now. I've got other things to do." So basically, what he did after leaving Lucknow, he set up his next stage of campaign, and that was basically to weed out rebellion, mutineers, insurgents, pretty much anywhere within his reach. So he started on a fairly rough campaign in December already, and carried on from there. Unfortunately, Calcutta wanted him to take back Lucknow again. It was a prestige thing, so he was forced to go back in March 1858 and take it back, which he did. Um, but on the other hand, the rebellion was pretty much being battered from many different sides at this point. I mean, we've got different campaigns starting up that were not only Sir Colin Campbell. We've got the Central India campaign starting up that started in November. We have the Transgogra campaign under Rowcroft, which was with the Gurkhas from Nepal. We have things going on the other side of Delhi. We have campaigns going on in pretty much everywhere. So what was happening now um, was the insurgents were being pushed from one corner to the next. I mean, Tantia Tope was chased pretty much the length and breadth of Bengal by the end of it. So then we have so he Rose comes on with the second Central India campaign. He takes on Gwalior and Jhansi. Um, so it was winding down. The British had their reinforcements, they had their men, they had more men coming in. They were using the Bombay army, they were using the Madras army. So they had far more going for them in 1858 after Lucknow than they had before. But of course, while this is all going on, there's a lot of politics in play. And the one who lost the most out of all of this was the East India Company, because this was their death. They were pretty much done for. They wouldn't be actually officially dissolved until the 1770 until the 1870s, but in 1858 there was a proclamation made that their reign is over. And they'd had just about enough of them because the East India Company had risked a heck of a lot with the mutiny happening in the first place. We're talking about money. It was money. It's what it basically came down to. It was money, revenue, somebody's pockets. And the government back in the UK was not happy. So they wanted them out and they took over. Yeah. And eventually, I think 1774 or 1770, 18, sorry, 1877, Queen Victoria was crowned Empress of India. And then begins what they call the British Raj. The Raj officially begins with the crowning of the Queen as Empress of India and not before. Yeah. And
Mm.
that didn't last very long, ultimately. I mean, they had less than 100 years then. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there's plenty of books to be written about all of this.
Mhm.
We've covered but a few months of the whole period. So no, it's been great, Eva. Again, I guess as a spoiler, you're always busy with your blog. Have you got any other kind of projects that you're considering or looking at for the future?
I have a few things in mind. I really wanted to go back and explore a little bit more of the escapes in during the mutiny. I thought that would be a very interesting aspect to look at, since I've come across quite a little bit more new information. I've picked up some new books, come across some new people to chat with. And I think I've put something together with that. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to carry on. I'm going to carry on with Mutiny. At the moment, the blog is currently stuck in central India. I'm working on Sir Hugh Rose, which is another interesting character. If I had, I think if I was brave enough, I would probably take on Sir Hugh Rose next. But I'm not sure I am. So I have to wait and see how I develop.
Yeah, well, you're definitely on a journey. So, just remind us, what's the address of your blog? Where can people check that out?
It's mutiny.reflections.wordpress.com.
Great. Yeah, please make sure you do check that out. There's so much more content on there. Eva, I think we'll leave it here. So,
Mhm.
thank you again. All importantly, if you want to buy a copy of Eva's books, you can check out our website, barnformpublishing.co.uk, or on Amazon, particularly if you're ordering from overseas. It is also available as an ebook as well, so that might help if you prefer Kindle to paper. So yeah, thank you again, Eva. I'm going to end the recording, and yeah, thank you all for joining us.